Calling to order the Public Infrastructure and Utilities Committee meeting. It is Wednesday, February 21st at 3:30 p.m. in the year 2024. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Balmer. Present. Alderwoman Keys. Alderman Browning.
Present.
Alderman Aldridge. Chair Schweitzer.
Present.
Alderwoman Keys. Alderman Aldridge.
Here.
I got you. That's 4 present. Have a quorum.
Thank you. Quorum being present, we will move on to the approval of the minutes from Wednesday, February 7th. I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes of Wednesday, February 7th, 2024. It has been moved and seconded. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Balmer. Alderwoman Keys.
Aye.
Alderman Browning. Aye. Alderman Aldridge. Chair Schweitzer.
Aye.
Alderman Aldridge. We have 4 aye votes.
By your vote, we have sustained the motion and approved the minutes of Wednesday, February 7th, 2024. We will move on to board bills for review. We will start with item number 1, board bill number 216, introduced by Alderwoman Shamim Clark Hubbard. You are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. Madam Clerk, can you read the summary, please?
Board Bill number 216, introduced by Alderwoman Shamim Clark Hubbard. An ordinance directing the Director of Streets pursuant to ordinance number 70333 as amended by ordinance number 71394 to install speed humps to calm the flow of traffic on the 700, 800, and 900 blocks of Bell Avenue.
I had to pick this mic up so I don't look like I'm bending over the podium trying to speak into it. But thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. This is, of course, another beloved speed hump bill in the city of St. Louis. And for these come clearly by request of our constituents. This is one of the reasons why I'm absolutely a proponent of the proposed Department of Transportation conversation that's been going on in the Charter Commission hearings, and echo many of the comments that our elder senior ward Alderman Balmer has made around this topic. So I know you guys have 1,000 questions for me about these speed humps, so I'm here to answer any questions and hopefully ask for your favorable consideration.
Thank you. And no speakers on this, correct?
We have none.
Okay, then we will move to questions from the committee. Alderman Balmer.
These are not designer humps, are they? There's no purple for your favorite color?
You know, they're not designer humps, but since you put that, I should note that they are by one of our amazing city public parks, which is Ivory Perry Park. And one of the hotter days that we've had here, these unreasonably hotter days we had here in the winter, we noticed children, trying to get to the park for the first time here this season. And it's just, people fly past the one stop sign over there, so we figured this could be a fix.
No, I agree with you, Alderwoman. We should not have to be sitting here approving speed humps. Speed humps should be a necessity, not a thing that's done by request and by ordinance. We should be installing a citywide program to put speed humps on every side street that is not a snow route, that is a cut between, and trying to find a way to do it. I believe we have the funding to do it, so let's see if we can find an ordinance to bypass this ordinance and go to it. Thank you, dear.
Absolutely.
I didn't mean dear. Sorry, that might be a problem.
You're fine. We're good.
We're just previewing our general desire to upgrade our streets. I love that. This feels like you guys are setting me up, so thank you. Cool. Alderwoman Keys.
I have no questions, but as usual, Balmer definitely is echoing thoughts that I would have about the situation as well. And so all you all got to do is just write the legislation. Let's make it happen.
Let's do it. Thank you. Alderman Aldridge.
No questions. I would echo the alderman from the 5th, but he has a flower shirt on again, so it's a no for me.
Okay, that feels unfair. Vice Chair Browning.
No questions. I hope the speed bumps achieve the desired result. Would also offer that I think there's a benefit to having someone else, not alders, look at this, because I think speed humps aren't always the answer. Sometimes it's other traffic calming measures, and we're certainly not in a position to be doing that, which is why we hit that speed bump button so often. But really hope that it solves the problem you're having and that it slows cars down.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to say to close?
Now, I for your favorable consideration and do pass recommendation for Board Bill 216.
Thank you. At this, I hope not. At this time, I will accept a motion for a due pass recommendation of Board Bill number 216.
Second.
Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Alderman Balmer. Alderwoman Keys.
Aye.
Alderman Browning.
Aye.
Alderman Aldridge.
Aye.
Chair Schweitzer.
Aye.
5 aye votes.
Thank you. By your vote, we have sustained the motion. We have passed Board Bill number 216 out of committee with the due pass recommendation. Thank you, Alderwoman.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, Vice Chair Browning, do you mind taking over for item number 2?
Yes. Alderwoman Schweitzer, you are recognized on Board Bill 217.
Thank you, Vice Chair Browning and members of the committee for hearing Board Bill 217 today. This bill is a continuation of our committee's work around addressing the outcomes on our street, especially outcomes regarding traffic violence. We have seen too much, too often, people dying, for lack of a better way of saying it, and for lack of a better situation that we're dealing with. And we need to look at the processes that our city uses to plan and execute safer streets. One of the things that the cities across the country have done is do what is called complete streets policies, which look at building streets that are safe for all road users. We have a bit of a history with this in St. Louis, and we do have a current complete streets ordinance that's in effect. It was last updated about 10 years ago. And since then, like so many things in 10 years, the processes and best practices have changed. So what this bill, the one in front of us today, does is seek to update the city's complete streets policy and bring it in line with the standards of complete streets policies today. Today we have folks from the city here to speak both on the current complete streets policy that is in effect, and also to discuss some of the planning around improving outcomes on our streets regarding the transportation mobility plan that will be hopefully starting soon. And this is all part of the process we're going through together to update our ordinances and processes in the city of St. Louis to have better outcomes. This bill that we have in front of us today has input and has been worked on by numerous organizations as well as input from city departments. So I want to especially thank the American Heart Association, Smart Growth America, TrailNet, the Community Mobility Committee, Transform 314, the American Cancer Society, and other community advocates for giving their input. We've worked on this for a long time and had a lot of input on how to make this policy the best possible policy. And today, because this is the first time we're hearing this bill, and it does represent a lot of changes for what our processes would be in the city of St. Louis around how we build streets, how we monitor how streets are built, and who is doing what. It's really important to take our time to go through this and make sure that what we're passing out of our committee is really what we think the next steps, the best steps are forward. And so today we won't be taking any votes. It will be very informational for all of us, including myself, so that we can be well informed. We will have time in the future as well for additional public comment, and the public will have time to have this bill in front of them to review and offer input on. And I do, like I said, appreciate the folks who've already taken time to do that. This bill has gone through many iterations since I first started sharing it with folks several months ago now. So first off today, we will hear from James Meerdink with the American Heart Association. He is an expert in complete streets policies and has worked with other cities across the country on their complete streets policies and is just a wealth of knowledge for best practices. And Smart Growth America, he'll be going over their sort of 10 key points of a complete streets policy and how our city's current policy, as well as the bill in front of us, either does or does not address some of those things and things that we need to really be considering. So he will give a presentation first, and then we will hear from Scott Ogilvy when planning and zoning, and Rich Bradley with the Board of Public Service about, again, the city's current complete streets policy, as well as efforts that are really in collaboration with this effort with the transportation and mobility plan that is upcoming. So with that, unless there are questions from folks now, I'd really love to go into the presentation from James.
Does the committee have any questions at this time, or would we prefer to go ahead and hear from Mr. Meerdink? Please proceed. Okay.
Thank you.
Madam Clerk, would you please swear in Mr. Meerdink, and we'll get started.
Mr. Meerdink, do you confirm, or I'm sorry, do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, thank you. You may proceed.
All right. Can folks see my screen just to make sure? Yes. Okay. All right. So yeah, thank you for having me, Chair Schweitzer and all the members of the committee. So I'll just run through my agenda real quick here, and then I'll do some more introductions. But really, I want to go back to the basics a little bit about what a complete streets is, because I think it's an important definition that we have to consider. And then the 10 elements of a strong complete streets policy, which really are laid out by Smart Growth America. They're kind of the recognized expert on complete streets. I'll go over those, and then talk a little bit about the current complete streets policy in St. Louis and kind of how it compares with some of those 10 elements in terms of the score. It's been scored, and just that shows us areas for growth in the current policy. And so I'll go over just a couple of those briefly. I also want to talk about how a complete streets ordinance can work with other planning processes and other kind of agency and departmental work. And then I want to point to a few examples from elsewhere in the country and among the list of best complete streets policies from Smart Growth America. But before I do that, I'll introduce myself. My name is James Meerdink. I'm a community advocacy director with the American Heart Association. I'm actually based in Cleveland, Ohio, but I do work on local policy all around the country, and a lot of that work is complete streets policies. I work, like I said, for the American Heart Association. Our mission is to be a relentless force for longer, healthier lives, free of cardiovascular disease and stroke. So complete streets really comes in because we believe that if we make it easier for people to walk, to bike, to do active transportation, they'll be healthier. And that really is our link and our kind of vested interest in complete streets. We don't do this work alone, though. So one of our partners and really the recognized expert on complete streets is Smart Growth America and their National Complete Streets Coalition. I know I've talked with, and I'm kind of a stand-in, honestly, for Dustin Robertson from Smart Growth America. So they are the experts, and a lot of the stuff I'll be talking about comes from Smart Growth America. So what is complete streets? Complete streets is, and there's some misunderstanding about this that we see, especially among the public. So I did want to hit on it quickly. Complete streets is really a decision-making process where all users are considered when we talk about designing, building, maintaining our streets and our transportation network. The emphasis there is on all users. So that means folks across the age spectrum, folks with different mobility needs, all races, all income levels, all that kind of stuff. It's really everyone, all members of our community, allowing them to use the transportation system. Complete streets doesn't mean that every street needs to have a bike lane or a sidewalk or something like that. Instead, it's really the process where we look at a street, we look at what the needs are, and then we figure out kind of what kind of facilities might go in there. And the goal, obviously, is safety, accessibility, and a transportation network that works for all residents. I did hear a mention of speed bumps or speed humps before. So speed humps are a facility. And so in terms of complete streets, if you have a process that looks at a road and looks at uses and looks at maybe high speeds on a road, speed humps could be one facility that would be recommended for a certain, road. There's all kinds of other things that might be recommended. But really, complete streets is the process where we get that decision made. Smart Growth America has 10 elements of a strong complete streets policy. So I have the website here where they list it, and they have really great resources as well. One thing to note about these, and I'll run through them here in a minute, is that they have evolved a lot over time. And so when we look at complete streets policies from 10 years ago or 15 years ago, a lot of them don't do that well when we look at the elements now, just because it's a field that's kind of changing pretty rapidly. So the 10 elements, and these are really best practice that we look for in all policies. They're also the way that we evaluate policies versus each other. And Smart Growth America actually has a scoring grid, and they use these elements to evaluate policies. So the elements are, the first one is establishes a commitment and a vision. Obviously, just laying out your overall vision for your transportation system and some kind of guiding principles. The second one, and one that has evolved a lot, I think, in the last 10 years, is prioritizing investment in underserved areas or underserved communities. The third one is applying to all projects in all phases. So this is design, construction, maintenance. There's a role for complete streets consideration in all of those project phases. Another one is allowing only clear exceptions. So this is, having a process where you list what kind of exceptions, essentially when complete streets facilities don't have to be included in the street and why, and how that's publicly communicated. Next one is mandating coordination. This is between agencies, levels of government, different jurisdictions. Next one is adopting excellent design guidance. So this is using, the recognized standards of the day when we're talking about facilities or even evaluation of streets. Requiring proactive land use planning. So complete streets is really a lot about having the streets and kind of mesh with neighborhoods and reflect neighborhoods or areas that they're serving. Another one is measuring progress, having good benchmarks and ways to evaluate the policy. The next one is having a criteria for choosing projects. And this is kind of the next level of complete streets, where you're not just having a list of projects, put to you, and then you decide whether they get sidewalks or bike lanes, but you're saying what projects could we maybe advance in the queue of transportation projects that would really serve needs in the transportation system or serve safety needs. The last one is really important. It's creating a plan for implementation. Again, this is something that the best policies do really well and are very specific and really lay out a plan and next steps for a city, a community. So just really briefly, we're talking about the current policy that's enacted in St. Louis and operational right now. Obviously, this policy is 10 years old or so, but I wanted to look at it versus a couple of those elements. So the second element is prioritizing underinvested or underserved communities. They have 9 points available on their scoring system, and the current policy only gets 1 point there. So obviously, this is an area for growth and an area where it looks like you could better serve the public and the community by really investing in transportation, in especially in active transportation, in communities that might not have seen that investment before. The next one is exceptions. So again, there's points available for exceptions, and the current policy isn't really dealing with this at all. So improving this area of a policy just would make everything more clear for folks and for the different departments that work in this space. And just as I said before, complete streets doesn't mean that every street needs a bike lane or a sidewalk. The exceptions policy allows you to kind of implement that. So if there's a street that has some safety needs or something like that, but say it's on a it's on a really steep hill, and the facility would be so expensive that it blows your budget for the project. That's one of the exceptions. Another one would be a highway or something where there's never going to be bike or pedestrian use. This is an interstate or something, right? That's another type of an exception. It's a little bit of an extreme example, but so having exceptions, listing them, making it explicit, and having a process where you demonstrate them to the public is really an important part of a complete streets policy. The next one is measuring progress. So this is essentially just, you set your goals for your policy, and then you need to set some kind of benchmarks or performance measures. So there's a lot of basically points on offer here, room for improvement, where the policy could just be more clear and more transparent to the public about how it's measuring progress. And then the last one is just back to implementation. So this is probably the most important, recommendation and place where complete streets policy has gone is you really need to chart a course and lay a roadmap for what's next, what agencies are working on this and who's doing what. And if there's additional planning that needs to happen, obviously that would be included in an implementation section. So this is a really important section and one where there's a lot of room for growth. Let me talk a little bit about complete streets and kind of the other planning processes that may go on. So in almost every place where we do complete streets, the ordinance works in tandem with other planning processes. So that might be a bike ped plan, a mobility plan, and those things happen. And sometimes you have different funding sources for those planning processes. But an ordinance is important because an ordinance sets the parameters in terms of public participation, could set the parameters for overall vision. It also can outline transparency and accountability provisions that the other plans might fit into, but really the ordinance sets those important parameters. And it also really gives the public a way to have some accountability for what's happening with, especially with kind of the next steps in complete streets. The other thing to mention, or one other thing to mention, is that a lot of other planning, if they have recommendations, will include complete streets as a policy recommendation or doing a complete streets ordinance. So they really do work in tandem. The last thing I'll say is that lots of complete streets policies that we work on, the ordinance is definitely not the end of the story. A lot of complete streets ordinances as a next step talk about departmental or agency rulemaking or regulations or other planning or other kind of documents or other work that's gonna happen to further refine how we go about doing the business of this decision making. So it's an important first step, setting the parameters, setting vision. But it's only one step in the process. So here I have, and this is kind of the frame, the discussion around kind of where do you look for examples. We have the 10 elements, but we also have, what other cities across the country are doing on complete streets. This is the list of the strongest complete streets policies since they did it last time. And really, because this is an evolving field, it's best to look at the policies that have passed at least recently in the last 5 years, because the scoring has changed and a lot of the best practice has changed. But I thought this was promising that there's 3 cities in Missouri that are among the 10 best complete streets policies in the country. I thought that was pretty cool. The other thing to notice is, the places on the list here are vary widely in terms of size, where they are in the country, probably the nature of the community in terms of rural versus suburban versus city. But we do see some larger cities, maybe similar to St. Louis on the list. But I know Smart Growth has over 1,700 complete streets policies in its database. So there certainly are examples. And if you run into a place where you need some inspiration on some of the elements, we have lots of lots of other places to look. So we don't need to like reinvent or totally, draft something from scratch. And just the last slide, among the policies there, I wanted to point out places where we might want to look for some of those areas where the current policy kind of scores really lowly. I don't know if that's a word, but does not score well. So in terms of prioritization of underserved communities, El Paso, Tucson, and Sacramento were the large cities that scored really highly in this area. In terms of performance measures, all 4 of the large cities on the list, El Paso, Tucson, New Orleans, and Sacramento, scored really high. And then the implementation section, El Paso, Tucson, and New Orleans, I think are great places to look for implementation. Obviously, they may have different structure in terms of different agencies, different committee structure, things like that. But in terms of kind of the detail they get to in their implementation sections, I think it's important to reference those. The other thing is Nashville, Tennessee is another complete streets policy that just passed in January. So I don't think it's been scored yet, but it's very similar to Tucson's policy, and I think it practice. So it's another policy that I think would be worthwhile for St. Louis to look at as you consider doing the update here. So I will stop sharing, and I'm not sure if we're doing questions or not, but I'm happy to answer any if anyone has any.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation, and really appreciate you taking the time to walk through all of those examples. I will go through the committee and see if anyone has questions for you, and we'll start with the person with most seniority, Alderman Vollmer.
No questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, Alderwoman Keys.
Sorry about that. I had a little trouble with my audio. No, great presentation. Thank you so much. But no questions at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Alderman Aldridge.
No questions. Thank you for being here to present today.
Okay, and I do have a couple questions. I'm wondering, as you're looking at these other cities and their complete streets policy, to me there's policy and then there's also structure. And structure is as important as policy in that it is how policy gets implemented. I was wondering if you could speak to different cities that you've looked at. Specifically, you mentioned Nashville has been really recent, and what kind of structures those cities have in order to carry out these complete streets policies.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, they do differ a lot. So I don't think there's any like broad. I guess there is something to be said for. There's generally a committee that is. There's generally at least some committee structure where you have citizen engagement, citizen involvement. Some communities just use one. Some communities have 2 committees, which is like a technical task force and then like a citizen committee. Those are just kind of generic names for them. And generally, you'd have more resident input on one, and the other one would have more kind of agency departmental folks. But that really varies widely. I think the thing that I'm sure that all the good policies have is really explicitly laid out how residents can be involved in the process, and then also how they deal with, the exception process is a big deal. You're always going to have projects where you can't do everything you want, but there needs to be a transparent way for whatever that public engagement is, the committee to be involved in those decisions, and to do it in a timely way where you actually have real feedback and some shared, decision making. So I think that's important, and that's something that you'll see in all the best policies. I don't think, though, that they had 10 policies listed there, and I'm sure the structure of the governments there really varies quite widely. So I don't think a good complete streets policy relies on one structure versus another. It's more about how you make the structures work together, and are you ensuring proper transparency, accountability, and public engagement.
Thank you. Yeah, I would agree that I think it depends on the city, and each city is unique. But things that place the resident, the road user, really somewhere in that process, and then allows that transparency to understand what is being done. When we see violence on our streets, or we see streets that feel dangerous, a lot of the responses that we sometimes get as elected officials is, "What are you doing about that?" And it's tough to answer that sometimes when, as you might have witnessed when we started this meeting by approving speed humps, that's how we do that in St. Louis, is we actually have to pass an ordinance to approve speed humps. But that's not the end of the process. We have to then enter it into City Works, which is a city program that tracks these kinds of projects. And then the project goes out to bid, and then it takes a very long time, sometimes over a year, to get the speed hump actually installed. So in the meantime, the resident who requested that speed hump, or the group of residents who requested that speed hump, are wondering, when is traffic going to slow down on my street? And so I think that sort of resident feedback and that transparency, as you pointed out, is super important. Can you speak a little to the importance of planning in achieving complete streets?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is different in, there are probably some of those communities on that list that are not as built out as maybe some of the other places. And so they might have a shot at planning whole new developments or new street networks. That may not be the case in St. Louis, or like in where I'm from in Cleveland. That's not necessarily the case. But you want complementary planning, and maybe you're also talking about the design stage of things. And I think stakeholder feedback, resident feedback in the planning and the design phase is as important as anything else. So the goal is, though, that each phase of the project, there should be a role for a fresh look. If you're planning a street, then you have kind of a blank canvas, and you should be able to get stakeholders together to say, what do we want this to be? If you're maintaining a street and you're doing major renovation or major maintenance, you may have another opportunity to do that. So there's just different opportunities in different phases of the transportation cycle, I guess.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you again for the presentation. Alderwoman Schweitzer, do you have another speaker that you'd like to present?
Thank you. I appreciate those questions, Alderman Browning. I agree we have fragmentation in the city of St. Louis planning process, whether it's an alderperson says they want to do work on a street and that's how something happens. But in this bill, it talks about having more planning efforts that are in the updated bill. In this bill that's in front of us today, we are talking about changing some of the planning processes and how that comes to be. So I think that's really important when we're talking about fragmentation of how the city does things. It's also recognizing our own role as aldermen in both perpetuating that and not necessarily changing it yet. So we need to figure a lot out to make the Complete Streets policy work, and some of that is on how aldermen do things as well. And that's going to be a lot of work and a lot of tough conversations about how planning happens in the city of St. Louis, as well as how everything gets funded on our streets. So it is kind of a Pandora's box of problems to address, and I think we're up to it. So I really appreciate Mr. Meerdink coming and presenting to us, and a few points that I just wanted to kind of go back to that he said is that an ordinance update can really work with the planning process as we figure out, what is the ordinance that the city has in place to create good outcomes on our streets. And then in making that happen, obviously it's not just, oh, here's an ordinance, now it just happens. In order for the words to be more than just words on a page and actually result in better outcomes on our streets, many departments, many people need to be involved and need to know their role and need to play their role well. And so one of the processes that the city is engaging in that's been funded through the American Rescue Plan Act is a transportation mobility plan. And I think that transportation mobility plan will work hand in hand with some of the work we're doing here to improve the ordinances that we are following in the city of St. Louis when it comes to our streets. And so our next speakers will be able to not only talk about the current complete streets policy in the city of St. Louis, but also the planning process that the city is undergoing to update and to better understand how something goes from an idea to actual implementation. So without further ado, if all right with you, Mr. Vice Chair, I'd love to have Scott Ogilvie and Rich Bradley come and speak with us about that effort.
Absolutely. And as city employees, I don't think we need to swear them in. So welcome, Mr. Ogilvie. And
good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thanks for the invitation. Much appreciated. Mr. Bradley, if you have anything you want to say, please come up and bump me out of the way anytime. Yeah. So I'm here to, I think, speak to or answer questions about let me introduce myself. Scott Ogilvie. I work in the Planning and Urban Design Agency. My position is called Program Manager for Complete Streets. So thanks for the invitation to talk about this topic. And so I want to talk a little bit about the current ordinance. I think actions that have been taken in the last 9 years since that ordinance went into effect that I think are steps that have advanced its implementation. And then I think what's really exciting, which Chair Schweitzer mentioned, is we are about to start on that citywide transportation and mobility plan, which is something that today the city does not have. We do not have a citywide transportation mobility plan. So it represents a big opportunity to really dig into, I think, a lot of the things that are on your minds and that are brought up today in the presentation. So just a super quick history. The current policy went into effect in 2015. I just kind of want to run through some implementation things we've done since then. So forestry, actually one of the first ones, 2016, they updated their street planning or their street tree list and planning procedures, which is really impactful in a lot of ways in preserving sidewalks and having appropriate trees in the appropriate places and right-of-way. And they have a tremendous map, a GIS map online that has data on basically every street tree and park tree in the city. It is a huge leap forward in information compared to a few years ago, so encourage people to check that out. In 2016, the city passed a traffic calming policy. And prior to that, we were not implementing things like speed humps and several other traffic calming features. Since that went into effect, as you know, there's been lots of implementation of speed humps across the city, well over 1,000 locations, and increasing all the time. And other traffic calming features as well on projects large and small. In 2018, the city became a NACTO member. That's the National Association of City Transportation Officials, which is a nationwide organization that helps cities educate themselves and the public and develops appropriate street design standards for urban environments. And there's a lot of helpful things I think we have gained from being an NACTO member. We've been participating for many years now with Great Rivers Greenway and collaboratively planning more and more ambitious projects in the city. The Brickline Greenway is really a partnership project between GRG and the city now, where we're both funding elements. So much of that is going to be implemented in the coming years. And those projects are really so much more ambitious than we would have seen a decade ago in the city. 2019, the city adopted a downtown transportation plan, which in some ways is like just a downtown version of the citywide plan develop in the coming year. 2020, Board of Aldermen passed a resolution creating the Community Mobility Committee, which is a citizen committee that city staff meets with basically monthly. There's a dialogue on transportation mobility topics. And that kind of filled a void. The city did not have what a lot of cities call a bike or pedestrian Advisory Committee. And so that the CMC has kind of filled that role for the last 4 years. The city, just very recently, two big updates. We adopted an ADA transition plan, I believe just about 2 weeks ago that was adopted, which is a huge step forward in guidance for the city on prioritizing ADA enhancements and improvements across the city, making the city more accessible, both in the public right-of-way, but also in buildings and services the city offers to the public. Additionally, Board of Public Service adopted traffic calming standards a few weeks ago, or last month, I believe, which standardizes a lot of traffic calming the city's been building in recent years, and has a lot of information for the public, for elected officials, to help everybody be kind of looking at the same features and using the same language to describe them. So that's a big step forward. And I would say, well, I have more on this list. We started the city's strategic land use planning effort, which is a really significant update to the city's comprehensive plan. It forms the foundation for how the city looks at planning. Miriam Keller in the Planning and Urban Design Agency has been leading that effort, and we're very, very cognizant of the fact that that needs to integrate and connect with the upcoming citywide transportation mobility plan. We're looking at those as really companion efforts. The timing is perfect that the strategic land use plan is leading, and the TMP will come alongside it as some of the core features of the SLOOP go into place. And I would also highlight really the unprecedented amount of projects the city is planning, designing, funding, and building right now. Both city projects and partner projects with Great Rivers Greenway and MoDOT, who we're working very hard with on building improved projects. We have about $300 million today in projects that will be built over the next several years. Either our projects, GRG, MoDOT, we're working all of those together. And every one of those projects has features or elements that we would consider complete streets elements. Some of them are complete right-of-way reconstruction with basically every safety feature and amenity you can imagine. Others don't go that far because of funding, but every one of them is being approached with an eye towards improving accessibility, improving safety, building permanent traffic calming features, and I think delivering on the ethos that is in the Complete Streets policy. And I want to get into the TMP, as I've been abbreviating it. So as Alderwoman Schweitzer said, funding for that was passed in Board Bill 120 last year. The city just about has under contract the consultant team, which is a really good team to start this planning effort. It's going to start probably next month. We're planning a lot of engagement with stakeholders, with elected officials, with the public around the city. And I think it's really important to recognize this is a new thing. We do not today have a citywide transportation plan. So we're going to build that, and that plan, I think, is going to address many of the topics that were in the presentation that we heard about. When I have to explain what this plan is going to be in one sentence, I like to say it's going to be the values, vision, and goals for mobility in the city of St. Louis. The consultant team we hired listed a couple key themes. They listed choice, safety, equity, and place as key themes they want to embody in that planning effort. And in the scope of work, I think there's many places of significant overlap with the bill that's before you. So things like assets and benchmarking, figuring out what data the city collects, how we collect it, what we publish, how we communicate projects to the public in a consistent manner so they can see what's coming up. And I want to really emphasize that we're going to build those systems within the planning process collaboratively with city departments so that we have the tools ready to go at the end of that plan. I don't want to do a plan where the plan says, you should start publishing more project info, right? I want to build the tools with city departments and understand our capacity to do that in the scope of the plan, in the work, so that we're delivering those products that the public can see as we go through the planning process. We're going to do a safety action plan. Sometimes this is called a high injury network. As a policy, sometimes it's called a Vision Zero plan. I'm not really putting a name on it right now, but what we're going to do is identify locations in the city of St. Louis that have the worst safety outcomes. We're going to map those, and that will become a thing that the city can work towards correcting those deficiencies, those unsafe areas. So it's going to be network, additionally hotspots, which, as you know, we've already started doing in the scope of that other Board Bill 120 work, where we identified hotspots, and that bill assigned funding to help make fixes. I think particularly relevant to the conversation today, built into this scope of work with the consultant is a policy and ordinance review. Specifically included was looking at the Complete Streets ordinance. So we fully expect to assess the current ordinance, to work through what could be changed, what could be updated to align with whatever is developed through the planning process. But other policy and ordinance too, because there's policies and ordinances across departments that impact project design, impact maintenance, all of these things. So we want to look across the board, any city department that touches on a mobility aspect, figure out what policies they're operating under and what things can be reassessed. There will also be a street typology guide, which I think if people think about a citywide transportation plan, this is kind of the image they have in their head, which is kind of two things. It's lines on a map, and it's images of what sort of the desirable design elements in those streets should be. So we have something to work towards as funding is available to projects. And then finally, we're going to be adopting part of this as an element of the city's comprehensive plan, which will build on that strategic land use plan and be a central repository of information in one place that helps provide guidance to the public, to city staff, to elected officials on the direction of mobility in the city. So from my perspective, extremely exciting time. Really looking forward to being able to dig in to, I think, the topics that are on your mind today. So that's coming. I am happy to see if Rich would like to add anything or answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Rich Bradley, President of the Board of Public Service. I think Scott did a great job explaining how this basically all sets up, but I do want to just emphasize a couple points because I think it is important. So we are actively doing planning now. He mentioned this traffic calming engineering guideline that BPS recently adopted in December. He talked about the ADA transition plan that I can tell you has been going on since my first appointment in the Slay administration. We recently adopted an ADA transition plan, and we are funding these items as well through different avenues of funding. One of the things that I think is really important to understand is this transportation mobility plan is an overall look at the city as a whole. I think a lot of you remember that we did traffic calming on a ward basis, and a lot of that was because that's the only funding that was available. And so what you got was a mixed match of items based on what a neighborhood needed due to an event that occurred and what an alderman thought should happen in conjunction with us in a quick manner. This transportation mobility plan looks at the whole city, and it looks at a number of different things. it talks about a chapter adopted into the city's comprehensive plan, which Scott mentioned, a safety action plan, which also looks at a Vision Zero action plan. And also, while we're talking about that, we're also currently working with East West Gateway and MoDOT on an safety action plan for implementation grants. So we can apply for those on federal dollars. It looks at mobility plans, our partners such as Bi-State, DRG, MoDOT, TrailNet, and so forth, and projects funding and capital investment required. And that is a big piece of this, because you can have a lot of plans, you can have a lot of rules, you can have all the framework, but if you don't have funding in place for these things, it's better off not to build them at all. And not only funding to build them, but also funding to maintain them for the long term. It'll look at policy and procedural updates. So one of the things that it really does is a deep exploration of internal policies, practices, and ordinance which impact mobility projects, planning, operations, and maintenance. It also looks at existing ordinances and ordinances that conflict themselves, which we all know there are a number of those. And then last but not least, it takes a real deep dive into street typology, which generally means that different classifications of streets should all look the same as you go across the city. And that's something that we have not really had time, money, or planning in the past to do. So this is going to really dig a deep dive into that. I think my final comments I want you to keep in mind are a few things. I do think all these are good tools, and I think there are definitely things that we should do, and we do them in the proper order. So we're adopting different guidelines. We're working through this traffic mobility project. But what I also want you to keep in mind is this. In my 15 years of being appointed in this job, one of the things that I hear from alders over and over and over again is how long a process takes. And so I know that comment very well. So I think what we have to do is we have to take our time. We have to understand what we're going to do. We have to be transparent. We have to have accountability. We have to have all the things that make this work. But in the same token, we cannot drag these processes out to where it takes years and years to get things done. So we need to find that simple balance between all of those things in order to get these things done. And again, as well as, make sure we have sufficient and qualified staff to implement all these policies. And it's not just a matter of hiring people, because I can tell you that right now, we can't find people that are qualified to do the jobs that we have. So we also have to be able to find competent and qualified long-term staff to be able to implement this. And then finally, again, the cost of implementation and maintenance of anything that we do. So that's all I have to say. If you guys have any questions, we'll try to answer them for you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, we'll go through the committee. Alderman Vollmer.
No real questions. I've been through this whole process with you, and before you were here, Rich, and I understand the problems we've had in the past, and looking forward to changing the way we do things, because as opposed to the I guess the parochial way things were done, and to get a citywide project will be one of the best things we could ever do. But I appreciate all your efforts. Thank you, sir. And you too, Scott.
Alderwoman Keys.
No questions. Thank you.
Alderman Aldridge.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I should have did my homework beforehand. So I'm just curious. I'm assuming you read the bill that's in front of us. How does this bill, the new one, because I know it's a repeal and it's more language, how does this bill affect the old bill or the work that you guys are trying to do with Complete Streets? Does it have, I'll just ask that. And I don't know, maybe if that's but yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I can take a poke at that, and Scott, if you'd like to comment on that. So I believe that what we should do is let the transportation master plan get completed. Scott mentioned we went through a selection process. We've hired a consultant. We negotiated contract. Contract is in the comptroller's office. It'll be back to us before the end of this week, and then it's 18 months to deliver that plan. So I would believe we should deliver the plan first and then combine it with this ordinance and see how that all shakes out.
To elaborate on it, what's the, I guess, so what you're saying is let this bill in front of us wait and play out and let the old bill play out. And I guess not my concern, but my question is, what would be the issue with this piece of legislation that's adding to the old one why you wouldn't want to adopt this? I'm just curious if it's stuff in the language of the new piece of legislation that is a reason why you would not want to adopt this and let the old language play out.
So I think that if we pass this now, there's an opportunity that we would have to come back and possibly amend some language, do things differently, look at some different approaches. And so, again, it may all come out to be exactly as it is. I don't know that, but I just look at the steps of the planning process and what we've accomplished so far. And this transportation mobility program, as I said, being across the city, look at everything, would give us a real good idea of some areas that we're weak in, our strengths and weaknesses and so forth, and address those better as we go forward.
Was there funding added to the old ordinance? No. So
Funding for the transportation mobility plan?
the complete streets policy plan, and Scott's saying no. So I was just curious. No, okay. Yeah, go ahead, Alderwoman.
Thank you so much. And, I appreciate that question. And it's one that I spent a lot of time thinking about when working on this bill. One thing that I think is really important is that the Transportation Mobility Plan will be taking a look and doing a review of the ordinances that are in place in the city of St. Louis and how the city does planning efforts. And I think having a better ordinance to review and work from makes a lot more sense, and going with what we already know are best practices from cities across the country who have done this work. And, a lot of what I expect to hear from our planning process is you all need to incorporate best practices of Smart Growth America's Complete Streets policy. And so going into the planning process, knowing here are the areas that we need to incorporate that we don't currently have in our policy, that we know are best practices, that we know are things that the city can do better, and starting from there and taking that ordinance, the ordinance that we could pass now or soon, and have that be what the transportation mobility plan is looking at improving and implementing, as opposed to taking a look at something that was passed 10 years ago and figuring out how to change it when we already know, based on the preponderance of similar complete streets policies that we've seen across the country that implement these best practices that have already been vetted and figured out and worked on by experts in this field. So I see the planning processes and a new ordinance working in tandem to have better outcomes for everyone in a much sooner time than just waiting and doing nothing until 18 months have passed.
So if I'm hearing you right, are you saying that the old ordinance, as they're about to move on the complete streets of the mobility plan, I'm probably getting confused, but the old ordinance is antiquated and your language will help that study be more, I don't want to say inclusive, but more up to date as they come up with their new study?
I think that's a good way of saying it. I mean, our job here at the Board of Aldermen is to think about the policy that our city uses to run. When Mr. Bradley was here a few weeks ago talking about ward capital, he was saying, we really make a lot of decisions here at the Board of Aldermen, how the city's practices work. So I think what we could do at the Board of Aldermen is say, we know that these best practices exist. These are the best practices and the processes that we want our city to be focusing on when we are going through an 18-month planning process to make this work. So I don't know that we need the planning process to tell us what we need to do differently. I think we know what we need to do differently, and we know that because it is a countrywide effort among, hundreds, if not thousands of experts and hundreds of cities that have done work to improve how they plan and execute street projects. To the point of things taking a long time and wanting to speed up the process. Yes, I agree that that's something that we need to do. And so if we know what our city isn't doing, and we do know that because there's scorecards and there's ways to see what we do and don't do and how we do or don't do it, then we should act now. And have a better policy to be examined by these folks who are coming in to examine how our city operates. And as I said at the beginning, I am not expecting us to take a vote today. I'm not expecting for everyone to think that the current draft of this bill that's in front of us is exactly what we passed out at the Board of Aldermen. I think that there is a lot of work that can still happen to better define who should be in charge of what as we start that and we do any efforts to change or look at what the bill says that's in front of us about who does what. We are simultaneously talking about the way our city departments function to carry out the work of streets. So there's going to be times in our city in which we are coming back to our ordinances and changing who is doing what based on changes that will happen. So I don't think it precludes us from working on this ordinance now and eventually passing an ordinance through the Board of Aldermen while the planning process is ongoing. I expect and would be surprised and disappointed if there were no additional changes or ways that we could improve based on what the planning process tells us. But I don't think we need to wait for the planning process to conclude before we enact best practices that have been enacted across the country by numerous other cities.
I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have a few questions, and I just want to do this for the folks at home because I think our streets and how we handle them is actually pretty confusing and in a lot of different spaces. And so this is not meant to be a pop quiz or anything, but whoever can jump in and want. But I'd like to kind of walk through for the folks at home which departments and divisions are responsible to handle different elements of how our streets are designed, maintained, and improved right now. So to start, can you tell me what department at the city is responsible for repaving our streets?
Good question. So the streets department repaves unless there are streets that the streets department cannot fit into their yearly work, and that work is contracted out by the Board of Public Service.
Okay, and what department is responsible for traffic calming, like speed humps, bump outs, speed tables, and other things like that?
Trick question, different departments. So the streets department is they are the ones when we submit our speed humps to CityWorks after the ordinance passes at the Board of Aldermen. The streets department compiles the location for all of those speed humps. Then the contract is from the Board of Public Service. And so that is sort of a two-tier question. Every single other piece of traffic calming that you mentioned is generally done through a design process through the Board of Public Service with input from Scott Ogilvie in Planning and Zoning, as well as the Streets Department, as well as aldermen, and often, always, in my experience, besides for very small improvements like one intersection getting bump outs or something, or a very few number of intersections getting bump outs, consultants that have a contract with the city of St. Louis to provide either a study and then the engineering, or some sort of hybrid combination of those two.
Thank you. And yes, that was a trick question. And a follow-up on that question, if there is a need for additional traffic calming elements, what determines whether there needs to be a study or that we can just kind of apply our knowledge and best practices and just implement that solution?
I will defer to you. I don't know that there is a specific guideline in terms of what does that. I mean, I would defer to you.
So Alderman, the question is kind of what's the threshold for what is an improvement that needs a traffic study versus what doesn't?
Yes.
So in my mind, the threshold is off. Well, there's a couple things. So one threshold is just the complexity of the improvements. Are they changing the operation of the street, or are they maintaining the operation of the street with maybe a slightly different design? Generally speaking, all improvements within the right-of-way are going to require engineering design. And so many times what that consultant is doing is that developing those plans that can then either be built through a citywide contract or bid and built by a different contractor. The recent work, so some things have been standardized over time. So speed hump design has been standardized, and that allows at least the design to be implemented in a more streamlined way. These traffic calming guidelines were just adopted by BPS, which is an additional step towards streamlining, and it provides some typical design features as well as typical and appropriate applications for the type of street. And so that should assist with a little streamlining in the future. But I think the nature of many improvements requires engineering, and therefore we do lean pretty heavily on consultants to provide that technical expertise.
Thank you. And what about
Love them. Explain more, the question about sidewalks?
Well, which department is responsible for the maintenance and upgrade of our?
Both the streets department and BPS. So some sidewalks are done 50 program, which is a resident request. And then if funding is allocated via alder people, the streets department manages those 50-50 repairs. Other sidewalk projects are initiated as ward capital projects through BPS, through a ward capital liaison. And so those are not resident requests, those are alder people requests. So both departments are working on those. And then the more major projects, so I think Jefferson Avenue is a really good example, under construction right now. That's a project that it's a major federal grant involved. BPS manages the design, engineering, the contracting, the construction oversight. And so that's where we're reconstructing basically the whole right-of-way as a component of that, that type of major project. So obviously we're taking care of sidewalks there as well.
Excellent. And I promise I'm not doing this to just be unnecessarily detailed. I have a point where I'm going here, but which department is responsible for bike lanes, whether painted or protected?
I think the answer is similar to that last answer about sidewalks, in that if the streets department is doing a resurfacing project where they are putting back what was already there, Oakland Avenue is a pretty good example of this. Recently, Oakland was resurfaced. The bike lanes went back right where they were before. The streets department performed that resurfacing and that restriping. If we are doing a significant upgrade, that might be contracted out. There's new design involved. BPS is more likely to be managing that process and getting a contractor to construct it. So again, it's both. I would say whenever it's a new implementation, though, there's going to be, generally speaking, there's going to be engineering work and design work, which is more likely going to be managed by Board of Public Service.
Thank you. And what about Metrolink and Metro bus stops?
Yeah, so Metrolink is owned and operated by Bi-State, two-state transit agency. Bus stops, Bi-State determines where the bus stops are. The bus stops are on, generally speaking, city right-of-way. Either the city or Bi-State can do improvements to those bus stop areas. We've done that both ways. It's more common that Bi-State does it, but there are situations where ward capital projects have been done to improve bus stops. And in fact, right now, the city is a joint applicant on a grant to East West Gateway with Bi-State to do targeted ADA enhancements in certain bus corridors. So it's a little bit of a shared responsibility. I would put it a little more in Bi-State's court than in our court traditionally, but we both work on it.
It's good to hear that you're doing a study on, for a grant that would focus on that. For those who don't know, some of the most dangerous places on our streets are actually within feet of a bus stop. And that's not because buses are dangerous. It's just because that's where people are walking, and it happens to be on busy thoroughfares where buses stop. And so people often get injured headed to the bus, which to me is awful. Part of the reason I'm asking all these questions is I'm trying to get at the fragmented nature by which we address our transportation system. I think when you think about your sidewalks and your streets, or your bike lanes, or your bus stops, all those tend to tie together. We don't just drive to our car and then suddenly pop into whatever building we're going to. We have to get out of our car and get onto the sidewalk and walk to our destination, sometimes a little bit of a way, or we have to get onto the bus and take it somewhere. And so all these things, they play together, and yet they're handled under different departments. And I'm wondering how much coordination and how quickly that occurs. But I also wonder, is there somebody at the city who is responsible for, say, interfacing with Bi-State on different issues where we do intersect with them?
Yeah, there's really a lot of us that work on that. I would say across, our department, planning and urban design, absolutely Board of Public Service, and absolutely the Streets Department. All those departments are working on a weekly and sometimes a daily basis with external partners, with Bi-State, with MoDOT, with Great Rivers Greenway. All of those entities are doing projects in city right-of-way. And so there's been a lot of close coordination over recent years. Northside, Southside Metrolink is in planning. There's been an enormous investment of time on the city's part to work together with Bi-State to advance that project. It's really a shared project. We're helping fund it. They're helping fund it. They're going to own and operate it. It's in our right-of-way. We got to work together through the whole thing. So I think that's the nature of a project like that, but I think the city's been very invested in working collaboratively with Bi-State on that.
Absolutely. And, it's tough because Bi-State's not under the direct control of the city. I think the mayor does appoint someone to the board, but it's not something that we can directly affect or make decisions about. So earlier today, I received a phone call about a contract that was awarded to, I guess, a LA-based firm by Bi-State to do the North-South Metrolink plan instead of a local firm, which was a little frustrating. And yet all I can do is call Bi-State and say, why'd you do this? And I have no actual control over it as an elected official, which is, needless to say, a little disappointing considering it's public transportation, which is the thing that Bi-State offers. But that's a tangent. I'm curious, who keeps track of, at the city, utility work, repair, and reimbursement from the utility companies for damage done to our streets?
I think this is a place where it's best if I turn it over to Mr. Bradley, who's more involved with that aspect.
Will you repeat the question for me, please?
The utilities companies do a lot of damage to our streets in St. Louis. There's a number of streets that we drive around, and the only problem with the street is the utility work that was done there and then patched poorly. Or sometimes we just end up driving over metal plates for months. My question is, who at the city keeps track of utility work, repair, and tracks reimbursement from the utility companies for the damage that they do to our streets?
So what happens is the different utilities come to BPS and they apply for utility permits to run in the right-of-way. The ones you're talking about generally would be Spire or Ameren, would be working on the public right-of-way. And so that is monitored underneath the street department and street inspectors. And they keep track of what they're doing, and they work with them in order to minimize disruptions. We have talked many, many times about master planning with them and what they do, what their yearly plan is, so that obviously they don't, tear up a new street that we pave. But inevitably, an emergency happens, and that's what they do. Now, an emergency is different than going every 10 feet and cutting a hole in a brand new pavement that we just put down. But yes, theoretically, the street department tracks that.
Thank you. And so when we're talking about a transportation master plan, I'm curious about implementation. So as it stands right now, a lot of the funding for these projects comes from alder people and ward capital, and on a ward by ward basis, which again is that fragmentation that I've been talking about. But can you speak to where the funding will come from to implement the transportation master plan?
So I think beyond ward capital, there's also citywide capital. There's also general obligation bonds. There's other funding sources that have popped up. You know, one of the basic things would be, in my mind, is that there would be a paving budget in the street department so that they would actually have funding in order to pave without having to come to the alders and ask for ward capital to do that. But generally, that's where I was referring to before, is that one of the things the Transportation Master Plan is going to do is come up with a framework for us to look at things. But we also have to determine not only what we need to do, but how we need to do it and how we need to fund it for the short term to build it and the long term to maintain it. And I think those are big questions that right now none of us really have the answers to.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the fragmentation and the ward by ward approach is hiding the fact that we are not budgeting enough money towards maintaining streets. And that leads to the condition that we often witness them in today, which I think we can all agree is not ideal. And I know there's been, some delays due to the pandemic and some paving issues that we've had, some broken equipment, and of course, always perpetual issue staffing. But the status quo right now is certainly something that we hear from our constituents very loudly, that streets are constantly the top concern of people when they're talking about the issues that matter to them, and an issue where they feel the city is directly responsible for the maintenance of those streets. I'm curious, you've kind of mentioned the funding sources, and I'm curious how important you think it is to move this process away from all and into a more citywide approach and a more single source, or at least a more city managed source of funding.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question.
Is it necessary to move this process of maintaining and improving our streets away from the alder people, both as the people who initiate requests for street improvements, or the people who are responsible for directing funding towards those improvements?
So I think the prior to fund that, it's easier to, have the public understand that.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, I'm curious, how can a resident check what plans there are for a street, whether it's repaving, redesign, or closure for maintenance or utility work? Is there a way for the average St. Louis resident to check and see what upcoming improvements might be planned, or if their street's going to get repaved next year?
So, I think we try to do the best we can with public engagement when we do different things today. All of our major projects include public engagement. I think as we go forward, the whole mobility idea is going to have to be more publicly advertised so people understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, that we are meeting the best practices that are available, affordable, maintainable. And, I think we always have to be transparent and try to put it out there to where the public can see exactly what we're doing and have input on it along the way. I do think that there have to be established standards that we know that we can afford to build and maintain. I think sometimes what happens is that people have expectations that are greater than that. And so if we don't do everything that somebody wants us to do, they're unhappy about it. But again, it all comes back to, what are the practices, and of those things, what do we feel comfortable that we can actually do and maintain?
Well, thank you. And I would agree. I do want to put this in the hands of the experts. And I want to make sure that we are not only properly funding and staffing these things, but that we're also not taking an approach where we're depending on people who may not really be all that knowledgeable in streets. I often talk about how, I call it the speed hump button, which is that residents say, someone's speeding, I want a speed hump. And so we end up just installing speed humps in lots of places, sometimes not even in places where there should be speed humps, much to the annoyance of the fire department or other people who need that. But I think it's interesting that we have a certain level of citizen engagement right now, but we often are not letting the experts lead the process, decide what is the best approach to take a more proactive take on our streets. So I really appreciate you taking the time to answer the questions today. I really do agree that we need a set of standards and to have a document that guides and says what are our priorities, and make sure that we are planning so that we know not only what we're going to do in the future, but also can be responsive to things that happen. So with that, I would like to add myself as a co-sponsor to this. I'm really glad we're updating this, and I have no more questions at this time. Alderwoman Schweitzer, you are recognized to close.
Thank you. Do you know if there are any public members who would want to speak today?
I don't show any public testimonies who want to speak. We have one in the drive.
In favor?
Yes, in support.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair, members of the committee, and especially to members of the city who came to speak with us today. I think what's important about this bill is it doesn't say every street needs a speed hump, every street needs a bike lane. What it does say is we need a process for making those decisions that is based on best practices across the country. And that's what this bill strives to do. So for those listening at home and who have interest in do something.
I'm sorry, we do have one who wants to speak.
Okay, wonderful. I will yield to that person, and we'll come back to close.
I'm sorry, I don't have your name.
My name is Saumek Narayanan.
Could you please raise your right hand? Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this cause is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to say that I'm in favor of a Complete Streets program. I think it's really important that whenever we're doing a transportation project, we're including people who are using all modes of transportation, not just cars, not just bikes, not just transit, but we're making sure that these streets are usable for everyone. And I think it's really important that if we have a process for upgrading a new street or something, that we make sure that when we agree, okay, all of these things need to be in process. If we do want to make an exception, we want to say not include opportunities for people who are using transit or bikes or even cars or whatever, that it is open to the public, and there's a really strong reason why we wouldn't make it complete and usable for everyone.
Thank you, Samik, and it's really nice to see you, a Ninth Ward resident, so really great to see you come out and offer support. Alderwoman Schweitzer.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for everyone who came, and as I was starting to say, for people who are at home, please do check out Board Bill 217. It is the draft that we have of the update of a Complete Streets policy. It is in, I'd say, first draft form, or at least first public draft. It's gone through many iterations as I've been working on it with my wonderful assistant, Christian Bishop, who did the lion's share of the research on this, as well as the many organizations I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation who have all given their input and to make sure that their community's voices are heard in this. And we are at the beginning of the conversation, and I do imagine that there will be amendments to this bill, and that people will want different departments to be directed to do different parts of the process as it is now. But we will kind of continue to take the public input. I would love to to have a public input session on this bill soon. One of the things that is coming up for folks, if they're interested in participating in March, Smart Growth America will be coming to St. Louis to lead a public input session with Transform 314 in the evening on I believe March 14th, and then there will be daytime activities and opportunities for folks to learn more about how a Complete Streets policy like the one we're considering here could be enforced and put to work in improving our streets in the city of St. Louis. So there will be definitely a lot of time for folks to engage, and I look forward to continuing to work with various departments in the city and the administration on this bill to make it the best possible bill we can have at this point in time. So thank you for hearing this bill today, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much, Alderwoman. And make your way back around here to reclaim the chair. I just want to say, yeah, shout out to our LAs. I know that Christian put a lot of work into this, and want to recognize him for that as well. So with that, I'll hand the chair back to you.
Thank you, everyone. I think this has been one of our longest public infrastructure and utilities meetings, and so I appreciate everyone staying with us here. Moving on the agenda, we have no resolutions to review, no committee discussions. We have acknowledged our written testimony. Any announcements? Okay. Everyone was present today, and so now I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Any call for previous roll? Hearing no objection to previous roll, we are adjourned. Thank you.